Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here as always with Walter Russell Mead of Tablet, the Wall Street Journal, Hudson Institute, and the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. The White House is moving quickly to undo the rules for how environmental permits are issued for federal projects such as pipelines, highways, and transmission lines. According to Bloomberg, an interim final rule removing the National Environmental Policy Act regulation circumvents the typical notice and comment process, meaning it can take effect immediately. Agencies generally only make interim final rules in emergencies, and they can still be challenged in court, but the courts are already tilting in the Trump administration's favor on rolling back federal environmental permitting regulations. The administration's aim is that the guidance under the statute will make permitting happen faster. But opponents say scrapping the rules will accelerate climate change, jeopardize communities' water and air quality, and spark more litigation. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, news in that something is happening. And while the courts may slow it down or whatever, I think the story is right that it's likely to be upheld. Now, this could only last 4 years if the Democrats come back in and they decide they don't want to go this way. You know, what you can do with a stroke of a pen, you can undo with a stroke of a pen. And so it might just be one more of the rituals on Inauguration Day or Signing Day, as it will soon be known, where each new president spends like 15 hours unsigning or signing a bunch of retractions, an ever longer list. And the country just flips ever more dramatically from one side to the other every 4 to 8 years. Maybe that's where we're headed. But I do think that the opposition to this is pretty wrong-headed. Not that they don't have a point, that actually probably, particularly given the current administration's bent, there are going to be some projects developed that maybe could have usefully used some regulatory review or more than they're going to get. But the truth is that even the Greens can't work with these regulations. We hear all these stories about how the Biden administration was going to roll out, chargers all over the country and do all these amazing things with these green climate laws, the IRA. And so they passed. And then, 4 years later, nothing. Maybe, hundreds of billions of dollars appropriated and like 7 chargers or whatever the number is. Some of that was internally inflicted with endless kind of DEI agonizing reflections that the administration basically tied itself up in a knot and tripped over. It's like tying your own shoelaces together before you start a race. But it was also these regulations, the sort of intensifying thicket. Why have you lucky people in California still not gotten your railway to know that fabulous, fabulous high-speed rail that goes from nothing to nowhere still hasn't been built. And a lot of that is that these regulations and lawsuits can ties a project up for years and decades while costs grow. And so the reality is we have a crazy quilt set of regulations and laws, of which these are only a part, that make it impossible to do anything, good or bad. And government must govern, and people must act. We cannot, this idea that somehow it's good government to stop government from doing anything. Stopping the government's role is to stop private enterprise if they decide to build something. We got to build stuff. And yeah, mistakes will be made. Snail darters will disappear. And that's too bad. And we should, within a reasonable compass, try to minimize those things. But in reality, if this country is going to survive, if our economy is going to grow, if our people are going to have the kinds of lives and opportunity they want, we are going to have to kind of clean out the undergrowth here of these thickets of regulations, often introduced at different times, all probably with fairly decent purposes in mind. Well, maybe not all, but many introduced with decent purposes in mind. But no one quite foresaw the way they would interact and twist in on each other. And so from like three or four very sensible rules, you end up with thousands of rules that it would take a very expensive lawyer and a big lawsuit to disentangle. So this has got to go. I'm glad they're doing it. Yeah, they're definitely doing it with a hacksaw. They're not doing it with a scalpel. Scalpel would be nice, but better, but you gotta do something sometime.
Is there a state that you think has gotten the right mix of, sensible environmental and safety regulations with building and permitting freedom? Like, is it Texas? Is it your new quasi home state of Florida? Somewhere else?
Quasi home state. Jeremy, let me just shine the camera a little
Ah,
closer
I
here.
see a gator on Walter's
You see
shirt.
a gator. I will say that, if thriving gator population is a sign of effective mix of growth and wildlife conservation, Florida is actually doing so well. Florida is doing so well that we're getting immigrant wildlife from all over the world, the Burmese pythons, the iguanas. Florida is a paradise that animals all over the world want to get there. So we can't be messing up the environment totally, let's say. And I think there are places like the Evergreens that are in better shape than they used to be. And may I say that the beautiful city of Gainesville, Florida, actually has a herd of bison in a state park on its outskirts. Yes, it
Really?
does. You can find right around in North Florida, right around where I'm living, you've got wild horses, gators, and not very far away, manatees. So something is working. Yeah, I think again, there will be mistakes. Human beings don't do things perfectly. That's just our nature. And then when you talk about sort of big developers, big industrial projects, the clash of big social interests filtered through a very inexact political process and courts that, sort of sometimes bounce too far one way and sometimes too far the other. Don't expect that we're going to sort of get Arcadia here and an absolute perfect blend of everything. But the pendulum has definitely swung too far in the regulatory direction. It needs to swing back. Now it'll overcorrect, but you know what? It'll then swing back a little more. It's kind of let's wait and see how it works.
All right, our second story. President Trump met with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the White House last week, and together they agreed to make the United States the biggest supplier of India's oil, replacing Russia. According to Reuters, the arrangements were made mere hours after Trump criticized Indian tariffs that he believes limit American businesses' access to the robust Indian market. A joint statement by both countries after the meeting welcomed India's steps towards lowering tariffs on American goods and increasing market access for American farm products, while declaring hopes to establish a trade deal between the two countries by the fall of this year. Trump also said in his joint presser with Modi that India hopes to increase its purchases of American weaponry by billions of dollars, promising to supply India with F-35 stealth fighters. Walter, news or faux news?
Bit of both in that statement. I would find it very easy as a foreign leader to sign on to any statement that says that I hope to do X and Y. Yes, I really hope. I really hope we're going to be able to do these things. It would make me very sad if, in fact, it would be tragic, really, if we failed. So I join you, Mr. President, in hoping that we're going to be able to make all these wonderful reforms. So there's definitely some of that in it. And when I talk to people in India, I have not heard an overwhelming desire to buy F-35s from Indian friends. I'm not quite sure what lies behind that, but it is a very expensive weapon, and India's defense needs are not, they're very unique, the Himalaya mountains and so on and so forth. So whether that would be a wise use of their money in the first place, I don't know. I do think it's worth drawing attention to this oil selling thing that that Trump hopes that the U.S. can replace Russia as both India's prime arms source and India's prime source of energy. That if those things were accomplished, it would be a very significant change in India's direction. But I have to say also, and we may get into some of this later in the podcast, for a man who's supposed to be working night and day to make Mr. Putin happy, and who is the secret Russia lover, the Manchurian candidate of Russia, now ensconced in the Kremlin, trying to turf Russia out of two of its most profitable overseas markets and break up long established commercial relationships. That doesn't actually sound to me very much like what Mr. Putin wants his puppets to be doing. I think in analyzing Trump policy, it is useful, I think, to start from this idea that America first actually is the way he thinks. That combined with some of his other beliefs may lead him to foreign policy steps that a lot of people, sometimes including me, have some real problems with. But that doesn't mean that, just because I don't like something doesn't mean that it is motivated by a slavish obedience to a foreign tyrant. So here at least we do see, and I think we also see India looking very hard for things it can do to keep Trump happy. And buying a lot of American stuff is clearly a way to do it. My guess is that India will have actually a very difficult time reducing tariffs, especially in agriculture. The farm vote is very important in India, and farmers in India have very strong views on the terrible things that imports do to their markets and to market prices. So I would not see that. There are a number of other sort of red lines in Indian politics on trade. I think almost all of them are bad for the Indian economy in the long term and even in the short to medium term, but that doesn't mean they're not there. And Modi is nothing if not a careful politician. So I think what we'll see is it's easier for India to address a headline trade deficit by buying more American stuff in things like arms or energy. It's going to be importing a lot of those anyway. So why not do your imports from a place where you get a political gain from the imports? And that, I think, is what we're likely to see.
It was interesting to see Modi and Trump back in a room together. Trump, I think, going back to his first term, has been fond of Modi in a way he isn't of many world leaders. Maybe in the first term, you could compare it with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, but he does seem to take to Modi in a way he doesn't with others. What do you think is either the nature of that interpersonal connection, or what does Modi know about Trump, about how to deal with him that others don't?
Look, I think there's a class of world leaders. Abe was one of them. Trump is another. Putin, in his own way, Xi, Modi, Bibi, Fidel Castro when he was around. There are sort of some world leaders are just larger than life. And, they, in a sense, they can sometimes be even bigger global figures than their countries. Fidel Castro being a great example of that. Yasser Arafat, when he was the Palestinian leader, and he would appear at the UN with his kafia and his machine gun, and it was just he just commanded the world's attention. So I'm not saying these people can be good, they can be bad. That's not what this is about, but they're bigger than the rest of them. You know, Otto Schultz, the Chancellor of Germany, is never by anybody going to be seen as a larger than life figure commanding the world stage. Macron is kind of a wannabe. He would like to be that. That's in a way the way to political success in France, but it just hasn't. He's never been able to make it work. Lula and Bolsonaro, both in their very different ways in Brazil, have sort of tried to get there. Certainly Nelson Mandela in South Africa. So I think there's a kinship that Trump recognizes in a man like Modi. And he feels that the two of them sitting in a room can make decisions and settle things, as he feels with some of these other larger than life figures. And like Trump, Modi's power came into power fighting an establishment, and a deep state, if we want to use those terms. So the Congress Party of India, which had dominated India's politics for most of the years, almost like the Liberal Democrats in Japan, been the dominant party in Indian politics. It meant that the civil servants were kind of, nominally nonpartisan, but had grown up in this. The university establishment, the press establishment, there was a Congress was a big tent. These people were not all ideologically sort of marching in lockstep, but Modi takes power against the establishment, a very settled establishment. So I think that's an extra point of kinship between Trump and Modi. And Modi has been, I think, successful in navigating the sort of complexities of Indian politics. He hasn't gotten everything he wants. He hasn't gotten the result in every election he wants. He hasn't gotten every bill he wanted passed. But he's found a form of charismatic leadership that has kept him, securely in power in the largest democratic country in the history of the world for 10 years. That's not nothing.
All right, final story of the week. The New York Times is greenlighting the use of AI for its product and editorial staff, according to Semaphore, saying that internal tools could eventually write social copy, SEO headlines, and some code. In messages to newsroom staff, the company announced that it's opening up AI training to the newsroom and debuting a new internal AI tool to staff. The paper also encouraged editorial staff to use AI tools to generate SEO headlines, summaries, and audience promos, suggest edits, brainstorm questions and ideas, and ask questions about reporters' own documents, engage in research, and analyze the Times' own documents and images. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, maybe I'm letting my Wall Street Journal colors show here a little bit, but boy, haven't they been doing that for a long time? Haven't robots been writing their stuff for years? I guess not. So, yeah, news or faux news? Is it faux news when something that is inevitable starts to happen? The Times, let's give the Times full credit here. Of all the all the legacy newspaper media companies in the country, it's probably done the best job at migrating to a mostly digital environment. It's gained what? It's something like 10 million subscribers. It's figured out, among other things, that news is not actually the most important thing they do. It's a little bit like a university with a large endowment thing, that actually teaching undergraduates isn't. It's sort of a loss leader, frankly. It's just something that you do. But really, it's the hedge fund side of your operation that really matters. And the Times, it's puzzles, it's crosswords, and then 80% of the news is chit chat. Some of the consumer reports on best vibrators, and just like crazy stuff that really, you kind of get embarrassed for America's newspaper of record at times. But I guess we live in the 21st century, and I just have to give up all those ideas about propriety and dignity. It's money now, baby. But however you want to, mock it or whatever, they've done something. They've built a new kind of a franchise and a brand, and they've only been able to do it by embracing these technologies. And they are now, they are becoming more and more of an information company and less of an old style newspaper company. And an information company cannot function without using the most effective tech in their field. And AI, for all of the sort of miserable shortcomings that it has and all of the hype that goes into it, there's certain things that it can do pretty well, and it's getting better at a lot of other things. So, my guess would be that a certain number of Times writers were already sort of quietly, checking with AI, like for summaries of information or things like that. And so that part of this is sort of a surrender to reality. Like, let's say we're doing it so we don't get embarrassed when somebody finds out that we're doing it. And let's also set up sort of rules and so on, to guide the staff. And so that we have a way of saying, no, 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 that was a legitimate use of AI. That was the wrong use of AI. Bad staffer, but you protect the reputation of the company as you move into this stuff. So I think this is inevitable. I think you'll see more of it happening at the Times and elsewhere. It's and here we are now. You know, will the chatbots start hallucinating, and will those hallucinations end up in New York Times articles? Frankly, a lot of hallucinations already do end up, at least sometimes, in the New York Times. So maybe not a whole lot of change on that front.
All right, that does it for this week's news. Let's have the big conversation. So, Walter, after Vice President J.D. Vance's combative appearance at the recent Munich Security Conference and Trump's decision to reach over the heads of NATO allies in Ukraine to begin direct conversations with Vladimir Putin, you wrote this week, quote, Mr. Trump's Europe policy is likely to have one of two outcomes. It could function as shock therapy, jolting Europeans into making the changes that could renew European strength and offering hope for a new and more realistic alliance. Or it could mark the beginning of the end of the transatlantic community that gave Europe its longest era of relative peace since the peak of the Roman Empire. So, Walter, I guess I'll start by asking, what is your frank assessment of the prospects for the former outcome you mentioned, that of Trump's shock therapy jolting Europe into a new era of strength and hope? I think a lot of our listeners are maybe in the habit by now of rolling their eyes at the possibility of that. But what do you think that outcome would actually take?
Well, I think it does. I think it would take the rise, sort of victories for some more far right parties, or else some more penetration of far right ideas into the platforms of regular parties. Now, I really don't want our readers to say, he's finally outed himself. He's like a, AFD guy, whatever. What I'm trying to say here is that the European consensus has congealed into this almost unbreakable, smug self-assurance. I've been saying to friends in Europe for a long time that you guys like everything about your policies except the natural and inevitable results of your policies. But your dislike of the results of the policies isn't strong enough to overcome your love of the policies themselves. And so you stick with it even when it's obvious to you that not only this isn't working, but it really can't work. And so we see Europe kind of deadlocked on just a whole range of questions, and a kind of timid liberal technocratic elite doing everything it can think of to try to stay in power, including becoming illiberal. You know, Vice President Vance was not entirely wrong when he started listing some of the threats to Europe. Personally, I do actually think Europe may have more external threats to worry about, but it is also true that if Europe could overcome the internal threats, it would need to worry much less about the external threats. I think we all remember, enlightened German opinion mocking Donald Trump's assertion that making itself dependent on energy from Russia was a bad idea, and this was just an example of this idiotic buffoon from America. Trump has certainly not forgotten that, and anybody with brains, understands that Germany has gone badly, badly wrong, and it needs to change direction. And it's very hard to change direction because, again, all the good people, all the people with experience, are part of this failing consensus. Britain, we can see this, France. And what we have now come to is this moment when it's no longer possible for the Europeans to conceal from themselves how impotent they've become. There's enormous hand-wringing now that America and Russia are discussing the future of Ukraine over the heads of the Europeans. The only people whose fault that is are really the Europeans. They have allowed themselves to become largely irrelevant, as in fact on Syria. Who cares what Europeans think about Syria? 50 years ago, Europe mattered a lot in Syria. 5 years ago, Europe mattered a lot in the Sahel. So Europeans have just been sitting there kind of immobile or doing little things that won't help, a lot of kind of displacement activity. And while that's been happening, the world has moved on. Europe has become a technological backwater. It's a military disaster area. Europeans are rich enough and they could be technologically advanced enough that Europe could be sort of an exporter of security. And it's not. It's an importer of security. Of course, that's the only trade balance Donald Trump, where Donald Trump has a surplus that he doesn't like, is in European security or East Asian security too, I could say. So they need to change direction. That first law of holes, stop digging. That is the one law. The Europeans would lock you up if you tried to say that, and I mean that literally. You could get locked up. Immigration, I think, is the maybe one of the most obvious ones. The failure to even think rationally about immigration policy is just an overhang of, it has caused the public, larger and larger shares of the public, to basically lose all trust in the establishment. And the technological revolution that is coming, that is going to reduce the size of bureaucracies everywhere, is going to thin out ranks of middle management, accelerate the robotization of the workforce, all of these things. The Europeans are completely unready for any of this. And you can say that in their different ways, Russia, China, and the United States have all moved into the vacuum that European failure and passivity has created. Russia moving into a security vacuum in Ukraine, China moving into the economic vacuum created by sort of failed German economic thinking, in general, the failure of the EU to encourage the kind of growth and technological development that could make Europe an effective competitor. And then the Americans just sort of pushing Europe aside. And this has an implication in world politics that I think people haven't processed deeply enough. Europe now, unless something changes, Europe is no longer in a position to be America's prime global partner. It certainly, I'm not trying to say Europe has disappeared. There's nothing there. There aren't ways in which we can and should cooperate. And I'm also, by the way, not saying that we don't still have a certain amount of heritage and values in common. I'm not saying any of that. But what I'm saying is that if Americans are trying to think seriously about our own security and our economic future and these things, we're going to have to make a lot of policy decisions that the Europeans aren't going to like. And more than that, Europe's failure gets at a basic question about American policy. Because, I once wrote, and I believed it at the time, in the sense I still do, that Europe was America's love letter to the world. That is to say, if you want to see what the American hegemony, if you want to use that word, has tried to do and what its goal is, look at what we did in Western Europe after World War II, trying to build a system where war among those countries that have been enemies for centuries was no longer possible, where you had democratic governance, where the countries were able to, you know, we were not giving them a lot of diktats. You can't do this, you must do that. But, and as we encouraged the rise of the European Union, even though in many ways that diminished our ability to influence the actions of Europeans, and that this was a new kind of international leadership that pointed toward the possibility of a better world. And wouldn't it be nice if ASEAN became more like Europe and the African Union and the Latin America? This is the project that America would like the world to follow, each part of the world, each country in obviously its own way. But what if the result of that is unreal, is stunted, is unsustainable? Then, what have we been doing since 1945? So, and what should we do now that we start to wonder whether that is an appropriate or possible way for world history to go? So this is a really big question, and I don't know that we've as a culture, certainly the Europeans as different cultures, have not really begun to work our way through. But Europe faces now a geopolitical revolution, a technological revolution, an economic revolution, and it's not ready for any of them.
Just one more question on this. Are there examples in history of declining geopolitical powers or societies or political systems that reform themselves in the way that Europe has to because they have to? As in, they don't just wait for an external shock like a war or a depression to leave them with no choice. Is that kind of within the realm of possibility?
I think the best example that comes to mind would be Meiji Japan, where they look at that European and American technology that's suddenly dwarfing anything they can do, and they say, "Okay, we got to get this. We got to get this right, guys," and they do. And I think you can see many other efforts in other societies. And since the whole concept of economic development is okay, our society, we've got to learn to operate on a different plane. South Korea, not at the moment that their political system is looking particularly healthy, but South Korea also has done this. Taiwan has done this. And while China certainly has its problems, there are a lot of ways in which China has, solved problems that in the past it could not solve. I think it's still got some it's not very good at solving, but it's moved. So yes, but the Europeans have thought that the American ideological and political commitments were there for good. And that, that sort of there would never be Trumpy America was a nightmare and it would never come, that was all over. And it thought that, for a while after 1990, it thought that everybody was developing. Russia was going to democratize all of these lovely things. So it has lived, it thought that the holiday from history was the end of history. It thought that the eye of the storm, the eye of the hurricane was the end of the storm. And it's now it's discovering that none of that was true. It's also, I have to say, there are a lot of things, what all of us do, and I certainly include Americans in this, is our societies educate us, how to get along with other people, how to get your way, how to negotiate, all of these kinds of things. And when we go out to engage with the wider world, we instinctively try to, the mindset that we develop domestically, we project around the world. And so Americans tend to think that everybody around the world likes democracy and that it's racist to think that somebody wants something different than we do. We hear that a lot in the sort of Bush era, Bush W era. It's racist to think that Arabs don't want to live in a Western style democracy. And the Europeans, both in their own national dealings and at the European level, have felt that they needed to suppress nationalism and suppress certain kind of strong forces of competition. So the way to get something done is to go through endless rounds of paper shuffling in Brussels, build these very wide coalitions that slowly move an issue along, not rock the boat. And there's a sense in which they approach international politics and kind of, outside of Europe. They bring these assumptions, and they tend to think that Americans are like them and have the same kinds of, historical experiences and worldview that they do. In fact, like all the American countries, maybe the possible exception of Canada, America's got a relatively thin layer of people in its kind of social elite who are European focused and do share a lot of these assumptions. Many of them worked for USAID and other agencies that Trump is going after with the weed whacker right now. And so the fact that the nice Americans that they met at international conferences and so on looked talked like them, appeared to think like them, regretted the same things about American politics that they did, and so on, led them, I think, to fail to understand the nature of the country that they were relying on for protection. And so the sort of return of Trump has really shaken them to the core because it's like a little kid who finds out they're wrong about daddy. Daddy's actually a monster. I mean, I'm not saying that Trumpy America is a monster, but it's just everything you thought was true about the thing you most relied on is now suddenly up for grabs. How that shock then radiates through European culture, European politics, that's going to be hard to say. I wouldn't be surprised to see that anti-Americanism, which is always a very popular play in Europe, really grows. It's for one, the elite will certainly want to make this about, oh, isn't Vance horrible? Isn't Trump horrible? Vote for me. And it will also, they won't want to look like they're toadying. And so they'll talk about, and the French will lead a lot of this with Gaullist rhetoric, that Europe needs to unify against America, or in the sort of Heideggerian sense, let's choose, but neither Russia nor America, but our own Mitteleuropan path, our beautiful path, unique path. So this is not likely to be a pleasant time in U.S. European relations, and the healthy growth of European self reliance may become a bit of a divisive factor in transatlantic relations. And you'll certainly see things like the French will definitely want to say, well, one thing we got to do is we got to free ourselves from dependence on American weapons and tech. And so, gosh, gee, only one country in Europe seems to build a lot of this stuff. So I guess we'll have to buy it from there. And yes, great idea, Germany. Let's break the cap on deficit spending for the purchase of French-made defense goods or European-made. We're going to see a lot of stuff like that going on as various interest groups and cultural and political groups sort of try to work themselves on this new ground. There will be people who will say, let's screw America by aligning with China. We'll show them we're not nothing. Let's see how they like it without us. We'll get that. Or Russia. We're already seeing some of that. So it's going to be interesting times. But in the meantime, in world affairs, this idea that a united West, self-confident in a certain version of liberal democracy, and feeling that the whole tide of history had moved its way and placed it in this position of leadership, that West, is it really still there? And there are a lot of countries I can think I can think of a lot of people on all sides of politics in India, in Brazil, even in Japan, where they're a little bit more nostalgic. In much of Africa, don't really like a West-dominated world. Not necessarily because they hate human rights or hate values. They just hate the arrogance of Westerners. So we're going to see a lot of changes, some of them not at all, I think, what Trump or Vance might have thought they would be getting. Some of them perhaps helpful. And it would be helpful if Europe took the steps that could restore, if not a partnership of equals, a partnership of peers.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Reader request this week, Walter. This one from Tamara in Seattle, who asks, what's been your favorite podcast to be a guest on?
That is a tough question, in part because I think of something, I believe it was Machiavelli said, if you do someone a favor, you create, 1,000 enemies and one ingrate. So if I say, boy, X is the best podcast I've ever been on, just, whoa, the revenge will be terrible. There are a lot of podcasts I've enjoyed being on. I was actually very surprised at how much I enjoyed a podcast with Jordan Peterson. It was long. He asked really interesting questions. He was clearly into the subject. And we had really a lot of time to explore a lot of issues. I thought that the podcast with Tyler Cowen was great. Tyler surprised me with some of the questions that he was asking, and I thought we had a kind of a conversation, a real conversation that I've known Tyler before. But this was letting the audience in on the kind of conversation that Tyler and I might have if nobody was listening in, and that has to be interesting for viewers. And I think he does that a lot. Barry Weiss was just really fun and asked good questions. She has a great nose for news, what matters. Dan Senor, I thought, again, that was a podcast where you really got into some good questions and the exchanges were at a high level. So, that to kind of pick out a favorite is both sort of invidious and impossible. But I would say good podcast, what makes for a good guest appearance on a podcast from my point of view? First of all, the host is someone who's kind of fun to be with. I think viewers can tell whether you're having a good time or not. And it's more fun to be in a conversation where everyone's engaged. It's also great to be with people who ask sharp questions that actually make you think. And there are two kinds of sharp questions. There's a sharp question that's aimed at tripping you up or fighting you, which is to spark controversy, but doesn't necessarily help anyone say anything more clearly. And then there are other questions where they say, but wait a minute, you say this and you say this. Do those really fit together, those two ideas that you're expressing? Or can you make sense out of these two things? And that then forces you to, either explain more clearly or sometimes think more clearly about what it is that you have in mind, so that you find those are kind of revelatory for the participants, maybe, as well as for the listeners. And then I also like it when podcast hosts either know enough about a subject to ask really penetrating questions, or are just naturally curious and bright people it may be an uninformed question, but it gets to the heart of the matter. So those are the kinds of podcast experiences that I like. And I guess I'll keep doing more, although sometimes people tell me, Walter, why don't you have guests on your podcast? Part of what I've said so far is, well, I'm kind of lazy. I'd sort of have to work. It's easier to talk about what I think than to try to ask somebody else about what they think. But we'll see how that goes.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.